Hey there, this is Hermod, and this is Pyramid from a company called Squarp. They are both hardware sequencers from a company that only makes sequencers, and they're very powerful and have a ton of features. The question is, does all this power come at the expense of ease of use? Let's find out. Alright, this video is structured in two parts. First, the review of Pyramid, so that if you're not into modular, you can watch just that. And the second part is about Hermod, which is the little modular brother of Pyramid. I thought of splitting this review into two parts, but if you're considering Hermod, you should also look at Pyramid as an alternative. This way you have everything in one place. Now, this is a very extensive sequencer. I'm not going to cover all its features, rather give you a brief overview and then talk about the features that make it special. In terms of build, the Pyramid is very solid. There are configurable encoders, an XY touchpad, and backlit control pads. The pads aren't velocity sensitive. There is a clear LCD screen, which is backlit as well. In terms of inputs and outputs, there's one 5-pin MIDI in, two MIDI outs, so potentially you can control up to 32 hardware synths or musical instruments this way. Expression pedal input, two CV inputs, and three CV outputs. An SD card for saving and loading projects, and it's USB powered and there's an on-off switch. Aside from power, you can also send and receive 16 channels of MIDI over USB. The way you build a song in Pyramid is you create tracks, and tracks can be almost any length you want and any resolution you want. And then once you have tracks in place, you can turn them on or off by muting them or unmuting them. Each such mute or on-off state is called a sequence, and you can create 32 such sequences and you can chain them into a song. There are 4 core modes in Pyramid: live, step, track, and sequence. In live mode, you can play notes either on this keyboard or using an external MIDI keyboard. And using these 2 rows as keys frees up this row to behave as smart pads, which are configurable to do various things, for example, play chords. And you can configure your own custom chords if you like and play in different scales. Each mode has an alternate display, which gives you more detail about what's going on. If I want to record live, it's really simple. Hit record. Now, notice the notes were quantized there. You actually don't need to quantize to any particular step resolution if you want. It's easy to turn that off and get the thing you originally played. Quantization is one of many MIDI effects that you can apply, as we'll see later. And it has multiple parameters as well. So the fact that notes don't have to be aligned to a grid is one of the strongest features of Pyramid. You can actually load entire MIDI songs into here and play them. Now, this isn't just a MIDI file playback feature. All tracks in Pyramid are stored as MIDI files, so if you bring in one, it becomes editable just like any other track. And subject to anything you apply to any other track, like MIDI effects, or a change in tempo, for example. There are plenty of MIDI files online, and it's fun to bring them in your project and make them part of it. Okay, let's move on to look at step sequencing. Now, they designed a pretty smart way to edit notes using just these 16 pads. You have a mode where you see all the steps in front of you, and you can turn them on or off. And there's a mode which is called poly mode, where each row can be edited individually. So this is the row for E4, and this is the row for G4, and we can remove and add notes for each and every one of the keys of the scale. Or if you want to edit all the notes stacked together, you do that in mono mode. Another feature that's new in 3.0 and really nice, and I'll go into my drum track here, is that you can create definition files for your particular instruments. Here I created for a 909 soft instrument a definition file where you can see the drum names on the display rather than just seeing note names like C2, C3, and so on. Works on CC messages too. So this is my kick, and so on. There's a forum where you can share these definition files. You put them on the SD card, and then you just call them up very easily using this function, the call function. I just have the 909 here, and you can add up to, I think, 8 or 16 of these. Now, there are 5 ways to enter information in step mode. The first is just entering notes like we saw before. You can enter chords as well. There's an entire Euclidean sequencing section. We'll talk about that. You can add modulations to the effects, the MIDI effects. We'll talk about that as well. And you can modulate and enter CC messages. So let's touch on this briefly in Euclidean mode. It's a really nice way to create rhythmic ideas quickly. Notice the green color here correlates to functions over here. So in this example, I have a simple kick and clap going on tracks 1 and 5. And the idea behind Euclidean sequencing is pretty simple. You set the number of steps and then the number of fills, and the pyramid will spread the notes around evenly amongst that. I also wanted to show you how to step sequence CC messages because that's cool too. So I'll add a chord here, just make it longer. And let me show you how to add, for example, pitch bend to that. So this is my chord, and I'll go into CC sequencing mode, and I'll choose what I want to affect, which in this case is going to be pitch bend, just so you can hear what's going on. Now there are 2 ways to enter modulation information. The first is you set a velocity, and you change that step. And the nicer way is just to draw it. That's a really cool feature in my book. Now you can see there are way more than 16 steps here in this graph, and that goes back to what I mentioned before. Whether it's MIDI, CC messages, or notes, you can always zoom in to a track and see more detail. Or zoom out and see the bigger picture. So that, in a nutshell, is step sequence mode. On to track mode. This lets you mute and unmute tracks. Just in terms of orientation, notice that yellow represents track mode. That means that these yellow labels apply. I already showed you zoom. Channel is where you select where you want to send the MIDI information to, and look at how many options there are here. It's pretty amazing. 16 channels on MIDI A, 16 on MIDI B, USB, and then this little function means that you can have a track transpose other tracks, which I think is pretty neat. Track length, like I said before, tracks can be as long as you want. The cool thing here is that they can get all polymetric on you. If you hold the knob and increase it, you can see we can get into partial track lengths. And Pyramid also supports polyrhythmic tracks, which means that you can change the time signature of a track. So in 3/4, a track will play across the same length as a 4/4 track, but it essentially will be a triplets track. Tracks are arranged in banks of 16, so there are 64 tracks overall per project, but actually you can create 32 versions of each track, so there's plenty of storage in just one project, not to mention the fact that you can store plenty of them on the SD card. Okay, let's move on to sequence mode. Now, this part was a little bit confusing to me at first because a sequence is not a sequence of tracks. Rather, a sequence is really a set of mute states, on-off states for tracks. So for example, imagine that your song starts with just this track active, and then you add this track, and then this one, and so on. So each of these is a sequence. And then you can chain sequences to create a song. You'll see this best in the display mode for sequence. You can see right now I created 5 tracks out of a total of 64 possible ones. 3 to 5 are muted, and 1 and 2 are active. And as I go through my sequence, you can see that different tracks become active. So in order to create a chain, I go down here, and then enter sequence numbers one after the other. Okay, the next power feature of the pyramid is MIDI effects. Now I mentioned quantize before. Let's just look briefly at a few more. The arpeggiator is always a favorite. And plenty of different drunk versions here. There's so many parameters here, it's just a lot of fun to play with. Now, just like you can chain your guitar pedal effects, you can also chain MIDI effects, only these effect notes. The harmonizer lets you create chords. Any hardware sequencer that can do things like that. If you are, let me know in the comment section below. Now, there are plenty of other MIDI effects. I won't go through them now, but as you can see, this is pretty extensive. So those are MIDI effects, and a couple more cool features. You can use the assign buttons to assign MIDI CC or effect parameters to all 5 encoders and the XY of the trackpad. And then, of course, I won't go through all the settings, but just to give you an idea of how much control you have here, let's look just at the miscellaneous parameters. There are a ton of things here. Live looping is a really nice function where you can record live and you don't need to set a predetermined number of bars. It will just go with you until you hit record again. And there are plenty more things that you can control through here. Okay, so that was Pyramid. Now let's take a look at Hermod. First, overall, you can see that it doesn't say sequencer here anywhere on the module, and it begins to make sense when you dive in. This can do way more than sequence. For example, it can also be a MIDI to CV module, or a multi-LFO, or a clock divider, mangle CV in real time, or a bunch of uses that I'm sure I'll discover over time. Now here too, the build of the unit seems really good. There's one clickable encoder, works really well. Pads for step sequencing, track, and sequence control, 8 CV and gate pair outputs, 4 CV inputs, MIDI in, MIDI out, 2 USB connections, host and device, and an LCD screen, which is backlit, a little bit small, but very readable nonetheless. You can have virtually unlimited projects in Hermod stored on an SD card plugged in the back, where each project can have 8 different tracks in 8 sequences for a total of 64 tracks. There are 2 types of tracks, note and modulation tracks. We'll get into the differences between them. Each track can have up to 8 effects. These are MIDI or note or CV effects, not audio effects. And there's also a mod matrix per track, which can take inputs from CV or MIDI CC messages and send that to various parameters or to effect parameters. By default, each track can be associated with one row here of outputs, a CV and gate output, but you can expand that. For example, this track right now, track number 1, has 3 output rows associated with it. This is CV and gate for each note that it sends, and then there's velocity and aftertouch information that can be sent elsewhere. Overall, Hermod has 4 global modes. Step mode lets you either step sequence or record live. Effects lets you manage, add, and remove MIDI effects or note effects. Track lets you handle each of the 8 tracks, and sequence lets you handle the 8 sequences. Again, a sequence is a group of 8 tracks. Okay, let's look at some of the details. Each track can either be a note track or a modulation track. You select that. Let's say I'll go into track number 5, go into layout, and then I'll pick one voice or one row. I don't want it to expand to more than one row for now. I can pick whether it's a mononote mode or a modulation track. So if I pick notes, it now becomes a note track. If I go ahead and pick modulation, it becomes a modulation track. Notice the appropriate color here as well. I can choose to allocate more than one voice or row per track and get more flexibility. Let's go up to row number 4 or track number 4. and I will pick a, say, 3-voice layout, and I get a lot more options in here. So for example, I could choose to use 3 rows as a mono voice with aftertouch and velocity, just like this first track here, which spans across 3 rows. Or I can decide that it will be a polyphonic track, which means I can play chords or step sequence chords, and they can go out to 3 devices or 3 different voices on a polyphonic synth. So this first track, for example, controls elements up here, but I haven't connected aftertouch and velocity yet. You can see row 3 is defined as velocity, so let's hook that up. And now you can see elements will respond to velocity. I can play softly or louder. Same thing, say, for aftertouch. I'll connect that to timbre over here. And you can see how aftertouch has effect on the sound. Now, once you do that, these outputs aren't completely wasted. You can use them to sequence gate events as well. Okay, so let's look at sequencing. There are 2 ways to sequence. I can step sequence or record live. Recording live is the easiest. I'll just go into track number 1 over here. This is my existing pattern. You obviously can't read specific notes here. This is just indicative of what's going on. And I can clear it and then hit play, hit record. And just like Pyramid, you can have Hermod repeat what you play precisely or have it quantized. Okay, so let's look at manual step sequencing. By default, every bar has 8 steps, but don't worry, you can zoom in actually to 8 times that. So in effect, per bar, you have 64 steps, and since you can make each track up to 64 steps long, that means you have in effect a resolution, a step sequenceable resolution of 512 steps, and even more if you play live using a keyboard. So let's go back to 8 steps in this 1 bar. If you have an external keyboard, you can sequence notes by touching a step and pressing a key. And just like Pyramid, you can zoom in and create micro steps. And this is a monophonic track, but you can sequence polyphonically as well. Of course, that would quote-unquote cost you in more output rows. You can also make triplets by zooming in 3x, which is pretty cool. Now, this piano roll obviously only gives you an overall idea of what's going on your pattern. There's no real way to know what a note is unless you press the step, and then the display will show it to you. You use this encoder to scroll through the pages, and a nice nugget here is if you hit step and this button, you can sort of scrub through all the notes. It's also an interesting performance tool. I'll delete this pattern. And another nice thing you have here is you can create random patterns or randomize certain effects. I'll just create a random pattern. And you can get pretty crazy results this way. When we get to MIDI effects, we'll talk about quantizing that to a scale. Another noteworthy feature, like in Pyramid, and unlike many sequencers, you can record both aftertouch and modulation. This also works nicely in independent mod tracks. Like Pyramid, you can literally draw sequences live. And step sequencing is just like recording notes. You select a step and you choose the mod height. And you can obviously zoom in to that as well. So those are mod tracks. Okay, let's talk about effects. We saw quantization before. MIDI effects are basically quantization and transposition effects and a bunch of other things. And I can go into a new effect slot and add any one of these effects. Let's take, for example, an arpeggiator. I'll just go through a few of these really quickly. Again, very like the pyramid. And you can modulate all these as modulation destinations as well. These are the effects. You can apply probabilities. There's MIDI delay, which is nice. Euclidean sequencing, glide, harmonizer, which will make chords for a polyphonic track. And there are LFOs. You can turn any one of these into a simple LFO with multiple LFO shapes. Random notes, ratchets, apply quantization and play notes only on scales. This works well with randomization of notes, and swing. And you can apply all these effects to anything coming in real time through Hermod. It doesn't only apply to sequences. You can run CV through this or MIDI notes, and the effects will be applied live in real time. Let's talk about the track mod matrix. In the effects section, hit Y, and there are 4 slots in this mod matrix. You can choose the source, which is any one of the 4 CVs, A, B, C, or D. And you can also choose MIDI CCs, any MIDI CC as a source. And then these sources are applied to destinations, and there are multiple ones to choose from. You can change sequences, and anything you see here. These typically are applied to the MIDI effects parameters. Okay, let's talk about sequence mode. Tracks and sequences behave differently compared to pyramid. There are 8 tracks in a sequence and 8 sequences which you can page through in sequence mode. You can set an overall sequence length, and there are various settings for changing between sequences. And if you want to create a song, you hold this pad and just type in the sequence of the sequences that you want to play. You can chain up to 8 of those. So, those were Pyramid and Hermod, powerful sequencers with a little bit of a learning curve. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comment section below. Hit like if you learned something. Hit subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.